Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm excited to start this session on the future of digital services. There we go. So with me, we have Remy DeCosmaker, open source lead, digital service at CMS, Ed Mays, the Deputy Assistant Commissioner of Infrastructure and Support Services and Chief Enterprise Infrastructure Officer at CBP, and then Christine Paccio, Director of Federal Civilian Sales at Equinix. So thank you all for joining. Digital services are transforming the way that government operates, and you all are seeing, or I should say making, these advancements firsthand. So we'll unpack the progress that you've made with your organization's tools and what's next when we think about how we engage with government. So to kick things off, Ed, your team at CBP oversees everything from drones to wearables to cloud-hosted applications. So how do you prioritize investments across such a wide digital infrastructure footprint to support both mission readiness and innovation?
So that's a really good question. I think the biggest thing that we do, first of all, let's look at that portfolio. It's ginormous. When you start to think about how many endpoints we have over 100,000 dedicated endpoints, right? Mm-hmm. We have probably another 100,000 that are operational technology. You look at 1,700 sites that we support, 89 countries in addition to the US. Mm-hmm. It is a huge operation. So most people think of CBP and they only think of the border, right? It's much more than the border. If you look at the commerce part of what we do, $5 trillion in terms of trade a year, that's the US economy. That's being driven by that. So all of those things are a part of that large portfolio. I think we're the second leading revenue producer in the US government, behind number one being obviously the IRS. So it's a big mission. But to answer your question, the big things are mission, mission-driven, innovation-driven, and those are the things that push us forward. We do a lot of rationalization, like weeding out those things that we no longer need. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we found a couple of years back, you start to look at your portfolio of tools and you're realizing, I've got more tools than anyone needs, right? How do I reduce that and find the things that are efficient, right? And those things that drive productivity. The other big thing is, in terms of driving that efficiency, looking at how do we automate, right? Automation is so key to everything that we do. I mean, I threw out a couple of stats about us. Our portfolio is very large. We have, a standardized CI/CD pipeline and a lot of cloud tools, right? 200 plus apps in the cloud, and migrating a lot of our HVA, high value asset databases as well. But with all of that comes things like cyber hygiene. Right? And that's one of those things that's critical to us. How to keep all that stuff patched, right? And updated. And that requires an immense amount of automation. Now, for industry in the room, the other thing I'd like to say is if you could reduce the number of vulnerabilities that are being produced, then I wouldn't have to patch as much. But that's how we focus, right? First of all, is mission, then innovation. How do we get better? How do we introduce new things? And then how do we start to pull out those things that are no longer driving value for us?
Right, that makes sense. And Remy, you launched the open source program office at CMS a little over a year and a half ago. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So first of all, it's good to be back. Thank you for having me. The open source program office at CMS and any open source program office serves as a center of competence for your open source strategy at an organization. Programs, policies, projects, everything that helps to support open source. And 96% of all commercial software contains open source software at this point in the software development life cycle. And On top of that, that represents about $8.8 trillion of value if we had to rewrite that from scratch. So that is a massive amount of open source to keep track of in every stack. And on top of those numbers, you have, I think, 30% of all Fortune 100 companies have an open source program office. So 84% of those are helping to develop or manage the generative AI infrastructure at their organizations as well. So open source program offices are a key strategy for the private sector, and CMS is the first federal agency to have that private sector style approach to open source.
That's super cool.
We're happy to do that in the digital service at CMS.
Yeah. So as we talk about some of these innovations, central to that is data. So Christine, as data volumes skyrocket and latency becomes more mission critical, how should agencies rethink their digital infrastructure strategy to support real-time operations? And then, as Remy was saying about generative AI, those AI workloads.
Yeah, so I was waiting for you to call on me because I had to clear my throat. And I was like, I know the minute I start talking, I'm going to have to cough. So sorry. I like this question a lot. I probably have a very different perspective than my counterparts here on stage just because I am looking at it from an industry perspective. And we're seeing a lot of different behaviors. But I think there's a couple things that really need to be kept in mind. Strategies have to include thought processes around latency, thought process around access to high performance compute machinery, and then you have to have the infrastructure to support all of that. And when we have conversations with different agencies, some of them are way ahead of the curve. We know that CBP and HHS and others have done a lot of homework and have done a lot of research and thought has been put into their digital strategies and their modernization plans. That's not the case everywhere, and some of that has to do with budgetary restrictions. But in other cases, there aren't the data scientists in place, there aren't necessarily the levels of expertise sitting in the room saying, well, there's these other aspects that if we don't consider them, our modernization plan will fail. And so there's components that I'm coming at it from an infrastructure perspective that I think have to be brought into play when you're talking about AI modernization, because we're not just talking about what you need today, but what you need 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And so when you're looking at the infrastructure, efficiency is really important. And how do you achieve operational efficiency? How do you achieve energy efficiency? Those things have to be talked about at the foundational level. You have to look at structures that, yes, they support your high performance compute machinery, but how do you cool them? How do you do that without massive power draws? You have to talk about things like liquid cooling. You have to explore sustainability, right? That's not as big of a buzzword lately, but when we talk about liquid cooling and energy efficiency, that goes back to sustainability and how we reduce energy consumption. So I could go on and on. I know we have a limited time, but that to me seems to be the main, the first thing that should be talked about as you build upon strategy.
Right, I totally agree with you. And Ed, as we talk about AI, some of these experimentations, how we manage the energy, the sustainability of it, there we go. CBP is experimenting with AI tools like Chat CBP, which is exciting, and to help these citizen-developed applications. So how are you seeing these tools reshape some of these daily operations?
Well, first of all, I think it's a whole new world and a brand new day, right? When you start to look at how we're going to and are using AI inside of CBP, first from a historical perspective, we've been using AI since probably around 2014, right? And with advanced models and that sort of stuff. In the last couple of years, generative AI has taken the fore, so we're at that in terms of like Chat CBP. But it's all about helping the person, right? That human that has to lead and accomplish a mission and a task, right? So Well, that's how we're using AI to help the officers and agents in the field and our people, wherever they might be located, to do their job better so they can become more efficient and more effective, right? So that they can actually apply, those cycles that they have to do higher order work, right? So that's one of the big things that we're doing. And we're, not just using Chat CBP, we're using other tools as well. We're going to introduce a MetaHuman this year, right? And MetaHuman is, is like an avatar with an AI base that it's going to, I think, be game-changing for us. So just think of this. If you were coming to a government entity for a service and you could speak to a bot, if you will, that can respond and understands to what you're saying, finds the information that you need and potentially packages it for you. For me, I'm going to, on the infrastructure side, Mr. Mark James, who's my cloud officer, is going to implement, it along with, I guess, one of our ticketing tools, ServiceNow, and some other things, our help desk, and even our enterprise operations center, right, to help us quickly we've got a huge knowledge base, right? And when you're looking at an enormous ecosystem of IT, things go bump in the night and they break, right? So how do you solve that problem quickly? Well, a lot of times it's, corporate knowledge. Ed remembers this happened on December 4th, blah, blah, blah. Right. Go fix that thing, right? And so we've got to do a lot better than that. And what AI is allowing us to do now is to look across all those signaling tools that are kind of like tripwires that tells us when a database has a problem or an operating system has a problem, and kind of putting all that together and saying, this is where you need to look, right? And so that's how we're going to be using AI. Now think of this, AI in the field. If you are a U.S. Border Patrol agent, being able to do translations, right, in multiple languages, really critical to us, or at an airport. Now, when I mentioned what we're going to look at with the MetaHuman, think of this. At some point, that having an AI that can actually see you, right, from a camera, right, and pick up on visual cues, right? That's pretty important because when you're interacting people from different places, we have different cultural cues, right? That might say, life is not going well for me, and how do you interact with that person? So I think AI is going to do great things for us. I think it's helping as we look at analytics. For when we're looking for things coming across the border that shouldn't, or if we're looking at a needle in a haystack when we're looking at economic data for trade, right? So AI is really good at those things, but it needs to support the human that have experiences that are broader. You bring those two things together, you have an incredible tool in terms of problem solving.
Yeah, that's super exciting. And Remy, what are some of the biggest infrastructure gaps you're seeing that are holding agencies back from adopting some of these innovations at scale?
Yeah, a big challenge, of course, is security and supply chain security. So one of the things that our open source program office did shortly after we were established was we worked with our Chief Information Security Officer and Office of Information Technology and partnered to launch a vulnerability disclosure program with CISA. So we partnered with HHS and the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. They have a platform where you create a bug bounty, and a vulnerability disclosure policy in a program just provides rules of engagement. So you say to hackers in the community, here are the rules for if you find a vulnerability in our stack, here's how you responsibly disclose it, and we will make certain commitments to fix those vulnerabilities and provide a safe harbor, which is really important because in the public sector, we don't have the greatest track record of treating security researchers very kindly when they report problems in our software, right? So this type of a program provides those safe harbor provisions and then also financial incentives. So we learned a lot from that program, and by just spending just north of something like $175,000 over the course of running two rounds of bug bounty. We're in our third round of bug bounty now. We had researchers identify over 200 vulnerabilities, potential vulnerabilities. We have accepted 55 of them and remediated 18 critical vulnerabilities. IBM says that typically, on average, if there's a data breach, that's like $10.9 million or so. So if you multiply those numbers together, that's a few orders of magnitude less that you're paying security researchers to find those bugs. And by offering competitive rates to what the private sector would offer, you're incentivizing those hackers to disclose them to your agency instead of the dark web. And that saves us a lot of money, it saves us a lot of risk, and it also builds trust in the community. And it's not just about whether or not we're paying the hackers. Some hackers, and once you build that trust with the community, even when the pool ran out in our first round, they were still disclosing to us vulnerabilities that they found, just because they wanted to make sure that we knew about them. And that is a well understood model in the private sector. And it's the first time our agency has done this, but there are dozens of agencies that have been doing this type of work. And it is a great example of how we can secure the supply chain. And if it's open source software, whenever we close a bug or security vulnerability, that can help CPB and it can help other people too, because we're all working with the same stack.
Makes sense. And Christine, Remy mentioned the supply chain security. What are some of the gaps that you're seeing on industry side?
Access to some of that machinery. I mean, there's always supply chain delays. I think it's gotten quite better in the last few years, which is good. It's also working with partners that maybe have access as well. So finding ways to get to the equipment that you need. And recognizing that you said something earlier that kind of caught my attention and I wanted to double tap on. It's yes, you want to target equipment that you're accessing through your supply chain. You also want to make sure that that equipment is enough to support the flexible usage of things like the AI adoption plans that you may have, right? That usage is dynamic. And so if you're going to be looking at different machinery, you want to make sure that it is large enough, expansive enough to support that dynamic environment.
Right. Yeah, and Ed, as we talk about security and as cybersecurity risks expand, how are you approaching the challenge of securing some of these high-value assets and emerging tech against these evolving threats?
So I think, honestly, when you look at security, it's job one, right? It's got to be built in. And, we do a lot of vulnerability management, right? But the big thing is, access controls, right? Making sure that you're monitoring those, making sure that you don't escalate privileges beyond where they should be, and monitoring your environment. So we're doing a whole lot of that. And I think most people that are in the security realm will say, it's not, if, but when, right? Because, all of our IT is an ecosystem. We don't build most of it, right? And so, it's built around trust. And the zero trust model is pretty important to us to ensure that we have the minimal amount of sharing possible, right? Unless you actually trust that entity. But as you look across the government writ large, right, you'll find that we're all at different levels of security and readiness, and those are challenges. We spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we've shored up our multi-layer defenses, right? Now, that's a good perfect segue into some of the other things that we're looking at. NIST started talking about post-quantum cryptography a few years back. We were like one of the first agencies that did test and ran the algorithms, and we're planning to actually secure one of our HVAs hopefully this year. I think there's some people in the audience that are working on that. So that's very important to us, right? Because there's when we think of cyber, I think we think kind of like in an old way, right? We're thinking about your basic hackers, and to some degree, the nation state sort of actors that are out there. But with the potential coming of Q Day, I think that everything that we understand could melt before our very eyes. So we're trying to get ready for that, right? And when I say that, you mean we're looking at elliptic curve cryptography, almost everything from everyone's watch and phone in the room to their computers to our satellites, right? It's there, and if that is breached, we're all in trouble. So we're working really hard on our end to try and make sure that we can get some defenses up. And so we're hoping to secure an HVA this year. We've already done a couple of smaller apps as pilots or POCs, but this is an exciting time. And I think that it's great to be in a leadership position at this point in time.
Yeah, definitely exciting, a little scary. Q-Day scares me. But Remy, when federal agencies are needing both speed and security in their data flow, how does infrastructure design play a role in future-proofing and then secure by design systems?
Yeah. You'll be, shocked for me to say that I think developing openly and as a community the open source way is one of the best ways to scale your infrastructure and do it in a cost-effective manner. We have a really decent example. There was a new regulation that came out for hospital price transparency a couple of years ago, and hospitals had to put a JSON file on a website somewhere, and the data quality was a difficult challenge. And so the agency came to the digital service and asked us, what can we do to make it easier for our partners, our providers, our customers? So we built a static website. It doesn't cost money. It doesn't need a server. It just does data validation and proves out that you are building your JSON file in the correct way. There were certain naming conventions in the regulation, and so we created a name checker that just said, hey, what's the name that you should have for your file? And because it was hosted as a public static site, any hospital could go to that website and use it. They could use it to validate their data, they could use it to validate the naming, and it cost a minimal amount of money, and we implemented it in a matter of months. And so when you break that down to the amount of hours that it saves hospitals, they don't have to install any type of infrastructure. They can just use it right from the web. And we estimate that saves somewhere around 193,000 burden hours across our internal folks who would have to do all that validation work when it comes from the hospitals and the hospitals themselves of having to figure out how to upload that data. So that's a really good example of how open source and developing in the open with minimal footprint and keeping efficiency and cost effectiveness at top of mind is a good way to build out. And that's the history. The future is very exciting too. There was a new law that was passed, the Share IT Act, and it is going to be coming into effect here at the end of the month. And it says that all custom developed software, whether it's by feds or contractors, needs to be available in a public repository. It needs to have metadata talking about what's in it and how it's funded and contract IDs and feedback mechanisms. And there are narrow exceptions, of course, for national security and national intelligence agencies and for protecting the privacy of individuals. But otherwise, the point of that act is the source code harmonization and reuse of IT, right? Mm-hmm. So reusing that code is very much has high potential for saving a ton of money because we spend so much time and effort rewriting things that have already been built. And there are enough new problems coming down the pipe where we don't have to keep solving the old ones over and over again. The amount of money that could potentially save, our agency spent $2.8 billion or so on IT spending in 2023. 700 million of that was DME. And if we could reuse just 1% of the code that we already wrote, that's $5 million of savings right there. If it goes up to 10%, it's like 25 million. 50%, it's like $250 million. And there are 400 federal agencies in the Federal Register. Not all of them have that type of IT spend, but if we could all be able to reuse the code that we've written, that could save us, the agencies, and the American taxpayers a lot of money and a lot of effort and bring a ton of efficiency to the federal government. So our agency is very excited about the Share IT Act, and we've been leading the way with the implementation at CMS and helping HHS and any other agencies. If they want to adopt our open source solutions, they're public, they're on the internet right now, and they're open source.
Yeah, that's super exciting. I'm going to be bugging you for an interview in a month.
Looking forward to it.
So Christine, same question. How are you approaching infrastructure design to future-proof some of these systems?
Absolutely. It's what I talk about probably more than anything, which is when we have conversations around centralized information versus what would reduce latency and what would help create a more interesting architecture, is going from a centralized point of information to a regionally distributed architecture. That reduces latency around the country. The other part of it that we take into consideration, it goes back to the compliance and the security measures. So we have conversations around things like, do you require data sovereignty? Do we need to be having discussions about not only distributing your information regionally so that it's talking back to your different offices around the country and you have that real-time reduced latency, but are you also staying within the confines of the continental US? There are a lot of requirements we'll get back that say, wait, we don't want to traverse through Toronto. We don't want to traverse through Mexico, so how can we do that? Well, we talk about creating virtual geofencing that keeps your information essentially restricted to the data centers within the United States. Another part of that, I would say, is around where you are, right? The edge is dictated by the end user. And so when we talk about regionally distributed infrastructure, we also recognize there's people in Hawaii, there's people in Puerto Rico, there's people in Alaska. And so we have to be mindful of what the nearest points are that can be the priority for where you live, where your data center lives.
Right, that makes sense. I have one more question before turning it over to you all, so get your questions ready. There are mics on either side of the room. But Ed, close us out, and Remy, Christine, feel free to add if you have thoughts on this as well. But as these demands and mission needs grow, what does the future of the digital infrastructure look like, and how can we strike the right balance between security, agility, innovation, everything we talked about? How are you approaching that strategy?
Well, I think it's one that we are, I'll just say it, we're learning, right? And we're going to, figure out, because there's a lot of balance, there's trade-offs, right? With everything you do, you can have the most secure system, that's not the most useful system, right? So you have to figure out where you are on that spectrum, and, between usability and security and usability and cost. And I love the discussion on design, right? Because I'm really big into human-centered design, because if it doesn't work for the human, it doesn't work, right? But the other part of this, I think in terms of everything, the key thing for us going forward will be a couple of areas. Cloud giving us flexibility and agility, all those data centers across the country, and pushing out, edge computing, right? Because, I think Gartner noted most, compute is now happening at the edge, like 70% or something to that note. And when you look at, where I do a lot of my business on the southwest border, northern border, you'll find that, we do a lot of things that have latency, so we have to figure out how to reduce that. So the cloud, the edge, I'm trying to balance those things. AI, ML, and it's learning, right? Where should you put the AI, right? Should it be down on a small device on a person, sensors on the ground, IoT, and all that sort of thing? And then, something that we didn't talk much about here, you did, Remy, but it's data. And data governance is so crucial, and it's got to be part of that balance, a big part of that balance, because I will tell you, in my environment right now, I have multiple copies of data. I probably need 3. I may have a lot more than that. I don't want to tell you how many more, but so those things, and being able to work through it, and just realizing that, it's a team sport, right? It's working, and by the way, my boss, Sanjeev Bhagwalia, says a phrase quite a bit. He says, we are a badgeless environment, right? And what that means for us is that, you've got the contract, you're on the team, you've got as much voice as anybody else here, and we want to hear from you. And as a matter of fact, the things that I mentioned today for the industry members that are here, I definitely want to hear from you about all the things that we're working on and how to make it better. So I don't have the answer, but I do know that finding that balance, it is beyond the things that we're normally used to seeing, right? If you're an acquisition person, you'll talk about cost, schedule, performance, or quality, or whatever, right? But this is a multivariate equation that we're trying to solve. And the biggest component in there is the people and how to get the best out of them.
Right, yeah, that's a great closing quote. So I'll turn it over to you all. Anyone have questions, you're welcome to come up to the mic. If not, I'm gonna grill you guys, so brace yourself. All right.
Hello, good morning. Thank you so much for your comments. This was an extremely exciting and interesting panel for sure. I wanted to ask a question primarily for our government panelists about procurement and software procurement in particular. When we talk about AI, cloud, all of these topics today, underlying, of course, is the software. The previous administration had developed, as you all know, a CISA software attestation. There was a lot of work done around the NIST SSDF, and this administration has just, opinions are perhaps varied, but perhaps eliminated the CISA software attestation. I was wondering if you could comment on how you're thinking about procurement of software going forward, and what are the steps you're going to take to validate that it's not only appropriate, but also doesn't contain software from prohibited sources and that sort of thing. I think the world that we talked about before was all around SBOMs and HBOMs and provision of that. We know that a provision of a singular SBOM at one given time is one given time, and it's kind of useless after that. So, I was listening to your comments, Remy, about the tools that you have, and I'm wondering, are the previous thoughts around software attestations and SBOMs, are these sort of antiquated? Is that not the way to go? Is instead the correct way to implement the tools that you all were talking about instead? And is that something that everyone should be doing from government to industry?
That's a great question and a very keen insight. As far as I'm concerned, this is my opinion here, not necessarily represent the views of the United States government, right? But the SBOMs are like the ingredients list on the side of a carton, right? It tells you there is this thing in here. It doesn't tell you how much of it there is. It doesn't tell you how it was cooked. It doesn't tell you where it was sourced from. If I, as a federal employee or as any business owner or project owner, if I have access to the source code, I can generate my own SBOM. So for me, the source, of course, is the magnum regia. That's the most important thing. And with things like the Share IT Act, there is a part of that provision is that agencies need to update their acquisition language to be in line with the Share IT Act. And so our agency, the Open Source Program Office, we have developed inbound checklists. So we've taken best practices from CISA, we've taken best practices from NIST, we've taken best practices from HHS, and we say, okay, here are all these industry, and said, here are all these best practices and scanners, the OpenSSF scorecard, a variety of other tools, GitLeaks and secret scanners, and all those things should be run. We recommend that in our open source policy and now in our technical reference architecture, and we point to those checklists as official agency policy. So the source code itself is the source of truth. So SBOMs are good when you don't have access to the source, but I think we're going to see a lot more source code access coming in the new month.
Thank you. All right.
Good morning. Thanks very much for sharing your perspectives. So one thing I want to ask about, if we think back just a few years ago when we did the cloud smart, cloud first policy, it felt like the direction from senior leadership was achingly simple: get to the cloud. And so I go back to something Christine had said about constrained conversations where there was only a select few in the room and the people that should have been there were sort of left out in the kids' table, so to speak. So when we fast forward now, and now the administration is talking about taking guardrails off AI, I don't know what that precisely means, but there is some concerns. So what is the plan when you're doing the strategy now, when you're taking a look at open source and trusted open source and trusted data? What's the plans now to make sure that, like Christine said, that you're not constraining the conversations, you have a consensus, but you're asking questions in a better way, not like how quickly can we get to AI, but what do we need to do to have a trusted AI, or trusted AI, because as Mr. May said, a lot of different countries, right? So we don't want to sort of do some cultural upsetting. Thanks.
So, great question. Well, first of all, we talked about ChatCBP. We could have had ChatCBP up and running probably over a year ago. We didn't. We took our time and we started to look at what guardrails we had to put in place over at Customs and Border Protection, right? And so I will tell you that one of the really, just from an organizational structure perspective, enterprise services, Office of Information and Technology, where I work, have done a really good job of hiring. If you look at, and why am I telling you this? It's because the people that are in leadership roles are all technologists, right? So, I have a computer science background, IT background, worked in the Marine Corps, all that sort of stuff, right? But our CTO, former, industry guy, spent a lot of time at many of probably the names that are in this room. And then you look at the rest of our staff. We're all like that. And what we bring to the table is adult supervision. Now, you might not think that is important, but it really is, because as we are looking, and this is what should be happening across government, right? I don't know what's happening everywhere else, but I can tell you, because you get something that says go forward, you have to ask yourself, what does that mean to our organization from a cost perspective, from a security perspective, from UX UI perspective, and so we do a lot of that, right? So yes, we'll get guidance to go forth and do great things, but we take a little bit. Sometimes we go really fast, but sometimes we take a lot of looks at what we're doing to see if what are the impacts. For instance, we're doing a lot of, I'll call it citizen development, right? With a lot of our agents and officers. And with that, we have to ask ourselves, what data are we going to allow them to access? Because some of it, they're not trained necessarily to know about PII and all the other rules of engagement. So you have to put some guardrails in place. And we do that for ourselves, to include AI. Right, and as I'm starting to build out some of the things, like I mentioned, the MetaHuman and some others, we're going to put logical guardrails around what we're doing so that we don't potentially lose personal data, right? That we don't share. I mean, most people have no idea that when you think of CBP and you think of data, you think it's all one big thing, right? No, our officers from field operations have one set of rules and laws for their data retention. U.S. Border Patrol has another set of rules, and these are not, recommendations, these are laws, right? So I have to make sure that we're balancing through all of that. And so it takes leadership, it takes thought, and as I always tell everybody about, the cloud isn't magic, it takes engineering, right? So those are the things that we've got to always have to put in place. I mean, obviously we're being unleashed to do great things. I love that. But you also have to count on the people that you've put in place to be good leaders, to be good stewards of the government's resources, and to make sure that we're doing all the right things, right? And that's really important. I think the old adage is managers do things right, leaders do the right things. And in our organization, we push not necessarily the technology, but the thought leadership behind what we should be doing. Because the technology that technology background has to be a given in these organizations. If not, you've really built something on a very poor foundation.
Yeah, thank you. And
I know we're over
Yeah.
time. I had just one thought, and this is not one agency specific, but I do think you have a very good point. Many agencies went to this all cloud, all in idea. They adopted it quickly. They thought, okay, this is the plan. And then in some cases, it didn't turn out quite the way they expected, right? You put all your information in the cloud, but you got to get it back out, right? Oops. So what we've seen is a shift in conversation around, okay, maybe the all cloud thing wasn't the full picture of what we should be doing. Maybe what we should be adopting is a more hybrid cloud strategy where we're accessing multiple clouds. And oh, by the way, we keep our really sensitive information within our own walls, and we just create a connection back to it so that there's a way to access it, it's confined, it's secure. We have a multi-pronged vision that lets us get a little more of a comprehensive solution than putting everything all into one basket. So we are seeing that. I think a lot of the conversations have actually shifted that way. So sorry, I know we're over time, but I did want to tell you there are many conversations happening around alternative solutions to the all cloud thought process.
Yeah, thank you all so much for answering those questions. This was a super thought-provoking conversation, and I appreciate all your perspectives. I'd love to follow up with you and see where we are. I feel like things change week to week, but a couple months. Thank you.
Thank you.